clock in her wrist said 4 hours and 11 minutes when Dana Reed hit the dirt at the edge of the salvage field and pressed her face into the cold gray dust of Kareth 9. She did not move, she did not breathe. She listened. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere. A low, subsonic tremor that she felt in the back of her molars before she heard it with her ears. The Veth did not walk the way humans walked. They did not announce themselves with footsteps. They displaced air. They arrived like pressure changes, like the feeling before a storm, and by the time you understood what your body was already telling you, it was usually too late. Dana waited. The tremor faded. She exhaled, pressed herself onto her elbows and crawled forward through the dust toward the edge of the scrap pile. A mountain range of shattered starships that stretched to the gray horizon in every direction, the ruined skeleton of 100 civilizations the Veth had collected, stripped and discarded. The whole moon was a junkyard. That was why they had sent her here. She told herself that was the only reason. She did not let herself think about the other reason yet. That came later. The clock said 4 hours 10. She had time. Not much, but some. She found a gap between two sections of collapsed hull. A Kessari freighter, she thought, recognizing the oxidized green finish that all Kessari ships used, and wriggled through into the hollow space beyond. Dark. Good. She sat up, her back against the curved inner wall, and let herself look at her wrist. The implant sat just under the skin, a small black module the size of a thumbnail, its face a grid of LED numerals glowing a soft and patient amber. 4 hours 9 minutes 47 seconds. The amber was deceptive. When it reached 0, the color would not change. There would just be a sound, a single, soft chime. And then the charge in the module would detonate with enough force to sever her hand at the wrist, and the toxin sealed in the secondary chamber would disperse through her bloodstream in approximately 30 seconds. They had explained this to her very clearly at the briefing. The Veth extraction teams had found ISOC's previous operatives still alive, their extraction data intact, and had reverse-engineered enough of humanity's intelligence-gathering infrastructure to cause what Colonel Reyes had called, with the particular blankness of someone describing something too catastrophic for normal language, an irreversible collapse of the network. This would not happen again. The implant was the solution. Get in, extract the data from the Veth processing core at the center of the salvage field, get out before the clock hit 0. If she was captured, it would detonate anyway. The proximity sensor read Veth biosignatures at close range and accelerated the countdown to 30 seconds clean. Simple. Survivable, Reyes had said if she was fast. Reyes had never been to Kareth 9. Dana pulled her pack off her back and sorted through what remained. She'd lost the primary charge pack in the drop. The Veth intercept drone had clipped her descent pod 3 kilometers up, and she'd come down hard, skidding through the upper field of scrap in a controlled fall that was only barely controlled. She still had the secondary charges, 6 of them, each the size of a fist. She had the magnetic grapple, the breach tool, the short-range jammer. She had the knife. She had 17 rounds in the pistol at her hip, and no more ammunition. She took inventory the way her father had taught her. Slow, methodical. One item at a time, place it in front of you. Look at it with real attention and ask it what it can do. Not what it was designed to do. What it can do. Those were never the same question. Her father had been a scavenger. Before the occupation, before Kareth Station fell, and the Veth took the outer systems, and everyone above a certain age had to make the choice between resistance and survival. He'd worked the abandoned orbital platforms above Meridian, picking apart the wreckage of the colonial era for parts that still had value. He'd brought her along sometimes, when she was small, and she had learned to read broken things the way other children learned to read words. She picked up one of the secondary charges, turned it over, thought about the hull fragment she'd passed on the way in. Polished steel, maybe 2 meters wide, sheared off something large and reflective. She thought about the angle of the salvage field, the way it curved down toward the processing core in the center. She thought about the Veth extraction team she'd spotted from the ridge. 12 of them, carrying the long-barreled resonance lances they used for close work, moving in a sweep pattern that would bring them to her position in approximately 40 minutes. She thought about what her father would have asked. What can it do? She put the charge back in her pack, shouldered it, and moved. The salvage field on Carath 9 covered 11 square kilometers of the moon's equatorial flat, contained by a low-gravity field generated from the process's core at its center. Without that field, the pieces would drift. The Veth were meticulous about their collections. Every ship, every fragment, every scrap of material from every civilization they had harvested over 300 years of systematic expansion was here sorted, cataloged, stacked. It was the largest graveyard in the known galaxy, and it was entirely organized. The Veth found disorder offensive, in a way that went beyond aesthetics. It seemed to violate something fundamental in how they perceived the universe. This was a weakness. Dana had spent 4 months learning it. She moved through the stacks in a low crouch, using the shadows between the piles, letting the map she'd memorized guide her. The processing core was 2 kilometers in, between her and it, the sweep team, plus whatever static emplacements the Veth had posted after the last ISOC incursion 6 months ago. She needed to get to the core, extract the targeting data from the navigation array, and get back to the extraction point at the eastern edge of the field before the clock ran out. 4 hours 2 minutes. She had made worse odds work. She told herself this. She did not entirely believe it. Telling yourself things with conviction was its own kind of navigation. It kept you moving in a direction when everything in you wanted to stop. First Veth sentry she spotted was alone, standing at a junction between 2 massive stacks of compressed starship hulls. The resonance lance held loose in its upper limbs, its lower pair folded in what Dana had learned to recognize as resting configuration. The Veth didn't sleep exactly, but they had cycles. Periods of reduced sensory processing that served a similar function. This one was in a light cycle. She could tell by the faint subsidence in the air pressure around it. She watched it for 90 seconds, counted its pulse, the slow luminescent throb in the bioluminescent patches along its neck ridge, measured the sweep of its sensory cluster. The Veth sensory apparatus was extraordinary in range and almost embarrassing in its blind spots. They processed in a 340-degree arc around the horizontal plane, but had almost no vertical sensitivity. Evolution had never given them a reason to look up. In their homeworld's dense atmospheric conditions, threats came from the same level or below, never from above. Dana's father, when she was 11 years old, had shown her how to climb the outside of a derelict habitat ring using nothing but a cargo magnet and her own weight. She had been terrified. The vacuum had been 3 millimeters of suit away. He'd gone first, patient, not looking back, just moving, and she'd understood eventually that watching him was the lesson. Not the words he'd said before. Just the watching, and then the doing. She found the handholds in the compressed hull stack and went up. The sentry never looked. It stood at a junction and pulsed and breathed its thin alien atmosphere through the gill structures at its sides. And Dana climbed above it and over it and dropped silently into the passage on the other side, landing soft, knees bent, already moving. 1 kilometer to the core. 3 hours 58. The haul came next. The one place in the salvage field she hadn't been able to plan around. It was technically a corridor. A processing channel between 2 long rows of compressed material where the Veth ran their sorting drones. A straight and narrow patch about 40 meters long, with no cover and no exits except the 2 ends. She needed to go through it. There was no other route to the processing core's access panel that didn't add 90 minutes to her timeline. She stopped at the entrance, listened, counted the drone signatures. She could hear them by the electromagnetic discharge they threw off, faint crackle that was almost inaudible, unless you knew to listen for it. 3 drones, moving in a pattern. She watched the entrance to the far end and waited until she could time it. 12 seconds between passes. 12 seconds was not enough time to walk 40 meters. It was enough time to run them. She ran. The first drone passed behind her as she hit the corridor. The floor of the passage was covered in fine metallic debris, shavings from the Veth's processing operations, and it shifted under her boots, threatening to give her away. But she was already halfway through, her arms pumping, breath controlled, the kind of running she'd done in training, when the only thing that mattered was the time. Not the pain, not the fear, not the certainty that she was going to fail. Just the time, the distance, the mechanics of the thing. She hit the far end with 2 seconds to spare, placed herself flat against the wall, and heard the drone pass in the passage behind her. A leisurely sweep. It had not detected her. She allowed herself 3 seconds to breathe, then kept moving. The processing core was a sphere of Veth architecture, which meant it looked organic, grown rather than built. Its walls a dark, chitinous material that pulsed with the same bioluminescence she'd seen in the Sentry's neck ridge. It sat in a cleared space at the center of the salvage field, surrounded by a 20-meter apron of swept ground, no cover. One entrance that she could see, a rounded aperture in the sphere's wall that irised open and closed at irregular intervals. There were 2 Veth at the entrance. They were not in a light cycle. Dana lay at the edge of the last stack and looked at her remaining resources. 6 secondary charges, magnetic grapple, breach tool, short-range jammer, knife, 17 rounds. The reflective hull fragment she'd noted on the way in was still visible. She could see it from here, propped against a compressed hull, 3 stacks back, catching the ambient light of the field's gravity emitters. She thought about what it could do. The Veth resonance lances worked by projecting a focused, coherent beam of gravitic energy. At short range, the beam was destructive enough to punch through starship hull material. At medium range, it dispersed into a shock wave. At long range, it became effectively useless. The Veth knew this and compensated by operating in tight formations. At the entrance to the core, 2 sentries with resonance lances were coverage against anything coming in at ground level from any approach vector. They were not coverage against a reflected beam. The Veth had never encountered a civilization that understood Veth gravitic physics well enough to use it this way. Dana knew this because she had read every captured Veth tactical document that ISOC's translation division had processed. The word that kept appearing in those documents when they described human combatants was a concept that translated loosely as unpredictably sourceful. The Veth said it the way someone might say dangerously irrational. They meant it as a criticism. ISOC had put it on a recruiting poster. She set the magnetic grapple for max tension, angled it at the reflective hull fragment 3 stacks back, fired. The grapple cable was monofilament, nearly invisible in the field's dim light, and it caught the fragment at the upper corner, just where she'd calculated. She set the grapple's return tension to maximum and then used the breach tool to rig 2 of the secondary charges at the base of the stack nearest the core entrance, angled to blow outward and upward. Then she picked up the short-range jammer and activated it. The jammer was not powerful enough to blind Veth sensors at this range. That was not what it was for. What it specifically did, because the ISOC Tech Division had designed it for exactly this purpose, was create a localized electromagnetic noise signature that resembled the discharge of a Veth resonance lance at medium charge. It was, essentially, an electronic impression of a threat they already understood. Both sentries turned toward the jammer's signature immediately. They raised their lances. They fired. The coherent gravitic beams crossed the open apron at 200 meters per second and struck the reflective hull fragment squarely, and because the fragment's surface had been polished to within tolerances that the salvage field's own preservation systems maintained, it reflected. Perfectly, but well enough. The beams scattered back at oblique angles, and one of them caught the nearer sentry in the flank, at the edge of its dispersal radius, and the sentry folded. The second sentry had enough time to understand that something was wrong before Dana detonated the charges. The explosion was large. The Veth's cataloged, organized salvage stacks were not empty. They contained the compressed remains of starships with fuel cells, pressurized chambers, with stored energies of 100 different types, and the charge Dana had placed was designed to compromise the structural integrity of the nearest stack, rather than simply destroy it. The stack fell. It fell on the entrance apron. The second sentry did not have time to move. Dana was already at the core entrance. The iris mechanism opened on the shockwave sympathetic vibration, a quirk of the Veth's grown architecture. She'd read about it. The living material of their constructions was sensitive to sudden pressure changes and would dilate reflexively. She went through and did not look back. Inside, the core was exactly as ISOC's intelligence had described, a central chamber with the navigation array at its heart. processing columns rising to the curved ceiling, the whole space suffused with a warm amber light that came from the walls themselves. It was beautiful in the way that genuinely alien things are sometimes beautiful. Not because it resembled anything human, because it was so thoroughly, completely itself. She did not have time to appreciate it. The access port for the navigation array was at the base of the central column, physical interface in a species that otherwise communicated everything wirelessly. She'd asked about this in the briefing, and Colonel Reyes's intelligence officer, a young woman named Castillo, who wore her skepticism like a second uniform, had said that the VETH maintained physical interfaces as a redundancy. In the event of catastrophic systems failure, they wanted access that didn't depend on signal propagation. They were, Castillo had said with obvious reluctant admiration, meticulous. Dana plugged the extraction module into the access port and watched the progress indicator, 40%, 50. The clock in her wrist said, 3 hours 24 minutes, which was more comfortable than she'd expected. Comfort had a way of evaporating fast on Careth 9. It evaporated when she heard the pressure change behind her. Not a sentry, not a drone, something bigger. She could feel it before she turned. The air in the core shifting, becoming heavier, the way the atmosphere changed before the Veth used their largest weapons. She turned anyway. You always turned. Her father had told her that too. You always want to see what's coming, even when you know. Especially when you know. The Veth commander was enormous. They were always larger than the soldiers. Something in the hierarchy was encoded in physical scale. She'd never understood the biology. And this one nearly filled the iris aperture. It carried no lance. It carried something she'd only seen in intelligence photographs. A displacement projector, a weapon designed to collapse localized space-time in a small radius. Non-lethal to the user's own forces, but catastrophically lethal to anything in the collapsed zone. It had 4 soldiers behind it. The extraction module said 60%. Dana looked at the commander. It looked at her. Its sensory cluster was fully active. She could see the bioluminescence, pulsing in rapid sequence, reading her, reading the room, reading the extraction module plugged into its navigation array. She was alone. She had a pistol and a knife and 4 secondary charges and a magnetic grapple. And the nearest exit was behind the thing in the doorway. She thought about what she had. She thought about what it could do. 70%. The commander raised the displacement projector. She threw the grapple. Not at the commander. At the ceiling, at the dense, chitinous arch directly above the iris aperture. The grapple hit and magnetized, and the cable went taut between her hand and the apex of the dome, and she pulled the release and the return tension launched her upward. Not fast enough to avoid the displacement field entirely, but fast enough to be out of its primary radius when it collapsed the space where she'd been standing. The floor beneath her buckled, a 2-meter section of it simply ceasing to exist, and the edge of the field caught her left boot and sheared the heel clean off. She swung on the cable across the chamber, let go at the apex of the arc, dropped behind the central column, 80%. The soldiers came in. She heard them spreading out. The Veth moved quietly but not silently, and in the enclosed space of the core, the air displacement was readable if you knew how. 2 left, 2 right. The commander staying near the entrance where it could use the projector without risk to its own troops. Dana set the remaining 4 secondary charges against the base of the central column in a ring. Not to destroy the column. The array's housing was hardened against that. But to create a concussive blast in all directions at floor level. She climbed the column, 90%. She went up the processing column the way she'd gone up the habitat ring when she was 11. Without thinking about it. Hands, feet, body weight, the small mechanical decisions that became automatic when you made them enough times. Left boot was compromised, and her footing was uncertain on the smooth chitinous surface. But she went up and she did not fall, and at the apex of the column, she braced herself against the roof curve and looked down. The soldiers were converging on the base of the column. The commander had moved inside, tracking her with the projector. It could not fire upward easily. The arc of the weapon's trajectory was limited, and it was recalculating. She could see the rapid pulse of its sensory cluster as it worked through the geometry. It was smart. It would find the angle eventually. 94%. She triggered the charges. The blast at floor level was tremendous, a ring of concussive force that hit all 4 soldiers simultaneously and hit the commander below the knee joints, folding it sideways, the displacement projector spinning free across the floor. Dana came down the column fast, landed hard, scrambled for the projector on one ruined boot, got her hands on it. The commander was already rising. Veth commanders were not incapacitated by what would kill the soldiers. This was known. She'd read it in the tactical documents, and she had not fully believed it until now. Watching it lever itself upright on joints that should not have worked after that blast. 100%. She pulled the extraction module from the port, tucked it into her suit's internal pocket, looked at the displacement projector in her hands. It was not designed for a human grip. The firing mechanism was in entirely the wrong place for her finger configuration, and the trigger masses was wrong. And she had approximately 2 seconds before the commander's was fully upright. She hit it with the butt of the projector instead. It was not elegant. It was not tactical. She swung the projector like a club with both hands and hit the commander's sensory cluster. The most sensitive structure on its body. She knew this too. She had read everything there was to read. And the commander's bioluminescence went white with what she assumed was pain, though she had no real information about Veth neurology and was working on inference. It staggered. She hit it again. It went down. She ran. The core entrance was blocked for the soldier. She blasted, conscious, recovering, reaching for their lances. She went through them the same way she'd gone through the corridor. Not thinking about the time, not thinking about what happened if she was slower than she needed to be, just the mechanics. She hit the nearer one shoulder first and let her momentum carry her through the opening while it was still off balance, took the blow from the second one across her shoulder blades that knocked her forward, caught herself on her hands in the dust of the apron, and kept moving. 2 hours 41 minutes. She ran the salvage field in a different route than she'd come in. No point in predictability. She used the stacks for cover and moved fast and trusted the short-range jammer to confuse any drones that swept nearby. Behind her, she heard the subsonic pressure change that meant the Veth were mobilizing. More than just the sweep team now. The whole security complement of the field would be coming. She had made a significant amount of noise in the last 10 minutes. She ran. The edge of the field was 1.5 kilometers. She'd done worse distances in worse conditions. She told herself this, and it was true and it helped. And also it didn't help at all because the help and the fear were both present. And she just had to carry them both and keep moving. Her father's voice came to her, as it sometimes did when she was running. Not a memory of a specific thing he'd said, just the tone of it, the patience of it, particular quality of a man who had spent his whole working life in broken places. And never once seemed afraid of the breaking. She'd asked him once, when she was maybe 12, how he didn't get scared in the old hulks, in the dark passageways, and the sections where the structure could go at any moment. He'd looked at her with an expression she'd spent years trying to parse. Not dismissiveness. He was never dismissive. Something more like surprise, as if the question had revealed something to him. I get scared, he'd said. I just get moving at the same time. You can do both. She had been 17 when Kareth Station fell. He had not made it out. She did not know if he'd made the choice or had the choice taken from him. She suspected she would never know, and had decided, somewhere in the years between then and now, that the not knowing was acceptable. What was not acceptable was stopping. What was never going to happen was stopping. She had signed on with ISOC at 19 and been assigned to extraction operations at 22, and been sent to Kareth 9 at 26, which was where she was now, running across an alien junkyard on a dead moon, with her boot sheared off, and data in her chest pocket that might. Reyes had said might. She had translated that to will. It was a choice about vocabulary she'd made a long time ago. Changed the course of the war. 1 kilometer. One of the sweep team found her at the 800-meter mark. She didn't see it until it was already firing. She felt the displacement of air and threw herself flat, and the lance's beam missed her by 30 centimeters and tore a chunk out of the hull stack behind her. She rolled, came up with the pistol and shot it twice. 2 rounds. She did not miss. She had been trained not to miss because there was never enough ammunition to account for missing. 15 rounds left. She ran. The extraction point was a natural hollow in the field's eastern edge, where two massive hull sections had fallen against each other to create a kind of tent. Enough cover for a person to hide in, and enough signal penetration for the retrieval drone to get a fix through the field's electromagnetic noise. She'd set the beacon before she went in. She needed to get to it and activate the secondary beacon and wait for extraction, which the mission plan specified would take 11 minutes from beacon activation. At 600 meters, two more sentries came around the edge of a stack ahead of her. She didn't slow down. She fired twice, not to kill. She was running at an angle, and the shots were suppressive, forcing them back behind cover and through one of the remaining secondary charges at the base of the stack beside them. The explosion hit the stack and it tilted, not falling but leaning, groaning, and the sentries were occupied with not being crushed. She went around them, 300 meters. The sweep team was behind her now, close enough that she could feel the air pressure of their approach. A lot of them. She had made a significant amount of noise. She had exactly the charges she had, the rounds she had, the grapple she had, 200 meters of open ground between the last stack and the extraction point hollow. 200 meters of open ground, no cover, a sweep team behind her. Veth sensors would track her the moment she broke from the stacks. She stopped at the edge of the last stack and breathed and thought. The magnetic grapple had 40 meters of cable. The stack she was standing against was not stable. She could swim where the base of it had been damaged in some ancient impact, where the compression of the material had sheared, and the whole mass was resting on a compromised edge. The Veth preservation systems had kept it upright by compensating with the gravity field. But if the field was locally disrupted, if, for instance, someone set a secondary charge at the gravity emitter node that sat at the base of the stack, node she could see clearly because Veth architecture was always organized and the organization was always legible, the stack would go, 30 meters of it, in a direction she could choose. She set the last charge. She set the grapple at the base of a hull fragment 3 stacks over, in the direction of the extraction point, and she looked at the 200 meters of open ground, and she breathed and she counted to 3, and she detonated the charge, and the stack began to move. She ran. Behind her, 30 meters of compressed starship remains fell across the path she'd come out of, and the impact sent a concussive wave across the apron that the sweep team hit like a wall. She could hear them behind her. Pressure changes disrupted, scattered, the organized formation broken into chaos. She ran across the open ground, and the extraction hollow was ahead of her. And she could feel the sensors finding her, could feel the lances coming up, and she activated the secondary beacon. As she ran and heard, 3 shots hit the dust behind her and 1 hit her pack, and she dove for the hollow and got in and pressed herself against the far wall and breathed. 2 hours, 1 minute, 11 minutes for extraction. She waited. The sweep team reached the edge of the open ground and stopped. She could feel them out there. A dozen pressure signatures, maybe more, calculating the approach to the hollow, weighing the cost of going in after her, against the certainty that she was cornered. The Veth were meticulous. They would do the math. They would figure out the optimal approach. She had 11 minutes. She counted. She had been taught to count in crises, because it was concrete, and concrete things were antidotes to the specific kind of fear that came from waiting. 1, 2, 3. She thought about the navigation data in her chest pocket, coordinates, timing windows, the location and approach vectors of every Veth fleet concentration in the outer systems. Reyes had told her what it would mean. She'd read enough of the war to know what it would actually mean, which was the same thing but heavier. 6, 7. She thought about her father, in the old hulks, hands on rusted metal, explaining the patience of broken things, how the breaking was not the end of the use. 12, 13. Outside the sweep team began its approach. 21, 22. Retrieval drone came in low and fast, the way they always did. No lights, no sound, just a sudden displacement of air above the hollow, and the cargo bay dropping open 2 meters above her. She went up through the opening without ceremony, without looking back, and the bay sealed behind her, and the drone was already accelerating, punching through the Veth's local field boundary at a velocity that pushed her into the floor. She lay there and breathed, 1 hour 59 minutes. The clock still ticking, the data still in her pocket. The hollow moon of Carath 9 already falling away below. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought maybe he would have said nothing at all. Just looked at her with that expression she never quite parsed, the one she was closer to understanding now than she'd ever been. The not depissiveness. The thing that looked like surprise. She thought it might have been pride. She had never let herself think that before. She let herself think it now, briefly, exactly as long as the acceleration pressed her into the floor. And then she sat up, checked the extraction module in her pocket, began composing her report. The war was not over. It was not close to over. Data she was carrying would change the geometry of it, would give the ISOC fleet targeting information that would let them hit the Veth, concentrations before the Veth were ready to move, would buy the outer settlements 6 months, maybe a year, of breathing room, 6 months of children going to school, 6 months of supply convoys moving without escort losses, 6 months of people living approximately the lives they'd been living before the Veth arrived, which was what people wanted. She had found heroism, not glory, just the approximate continuation of ordinary things. It was not nothing. In her experience, it was most of what there was. The drone broke atmosphere, and the stars came up, the real ones, not the salvage field's gravity emitters, and she looked at them through the small porthole and recognized constellations that human navigators had named, and Veth tactical maps had overwritten with their own designations. And she thought about the fact that the stars did not care about either set of names, and she found this, reasons she could not entirely articulate, comforting. The clock hit 1 hour 47 minutes, and she deactivated the implant's proximity sensor, standard procedure post-extraction, when the threat of capture had passed, and the amber numerals faded to standby. She would have it removed when she debriefed. They always removed them on return. Every time she told herself she would not go back, and every time, standing in the debrief room, with the implant gone, and a coffee in her hand and Reyes across the table, with that careful, measuring look she'd learned to read as respect, she agreed to go back. She was not yet sure if this made her brave or simply unable to stop. She suspected after enough time in broken places that those were the same thing. Get up. Keep moving. The drone flew on through the dark, carrying its cargo of hard-won data and one very tired human, toward the light of a distant and improbable sun. Later, months later, in the aftermath of the Battle of Vel Station, where the ISOC fleet used the navigation data to intercept and destroy the Veth's third expansion fleet, before it could reach the inner systems, a Veth tactical commander would submit to an intelligence, debriefing with the words that would be translated roughly as, "We did not account for this. For the ones who do not stop." Dana was not in the room when they said it. She was in a salvage yard on the other side of the system, in a derelict Kessari habitat, looking at a piece of broken machinery and thinking about what it could do. The clock in her wrist said, 1 hour 42 minutes. She was already moving. The debrief room at Forward Operating Base Kessler smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, the same as every debrief room Dana had ever sat in, which she had decided was either comforting or depressing depending on the day. Today she decided it was comforting. She was alive. The data was on Reyes's desk. The coffee was burnt, but it existed, which was more than could be said for a number of things. Castillo was at the corner console, running the extraction module through verification, face doing the thing it always did when data came back cleaner than expected. A compression of the mouth that in anyone else would have been a smile. Reyes stood at the window. The base's single window looked out over the refueling pad, which was not scenic, but Reyes always stood at windows anyway. Dana had once asked him why, and he'd said something about lines of sight that she suspected was only half. The answer, transit data verified, Castillo said without looking up, all nodes intact. We have complete targeting packages for 17 fleet concentrations. Vel Station, Outer Kira, the Meridian Approach Corridor. Reyes turned from the window, looked at Dana. Any complications? Dana thought about the displacement projector, the polished hull plate, the stack she'd brought down on the sweep team, the boot heel sheared off by a collapsing field, the commander's sensory cluster. Some, she said. Reyes nodded. He had been military for 30 years and had fought the Veth for 11 of them, and he had the particular quality of leaders who had long since stopped requiring bravery to be explained or narrated. He just received it, accounted for it, and moved on. She appreciated this about him more than almost anything else. The implant's been scheduled for removal at 1700, he said. Medical Bay 2. After that, 48 hours stand down, then you're available for the Vel Station coordination brief. He paused. Good work. Dana drank her coffee. It was genuinely terrible. She drank it anyway. The Veth are going to reconfigure their security protocols, Castillo said, still not looking up. After Careth 9, they'll have recorded everything. They'll analyze it and they'll adapt. They always do, Dana said. They'll be better the next time. They always are. Castillo looked up then. She had an analyst's face. Everything processed. Nothing wasted. And she was looking at Dana with something that was not quite a question. Does that bother you? Running a playbook against an opponent that learns from every run? Dana set down the coffee. Thought about the salvage field, the scale of it. The accumulated remains of 300 years of systematic Veth expansion. Every civilization they'd collected, stripped, catalogued. The largest graveyard in the known galaxy, perfectly organized. They learn what we did, she said. They don't learn why we did it. There's a gap there, and I don't think they know how to close it. Castillo considered this, turned back to her console. That's not much of a margin. No, Dana said, but it's what we've got. Outside on the refueling pad, a cargo drone was being loaded with a supply run to the outer settlements. Crates of medicine and food, and the small consumer items that people needed to maintain the sense that ordinary life was continuing, that the suspension of ordinary things was temporary, that there was still a future being worked toward rather than simply a present being survived. Dana watched it through the window that Reyes had vacated. She thought about her father's hands on rusted metal, the patience of them, the way he'd handed her the cargo magnet when she was 11 and said nothing, just waited, until she figured out the grip for herself. She thought about the Veth tactical document she'd read before deployment, the one that described human combatants as unpredictably resourceful in the specific tone of something that was a criticism. And also, underneath the criticism, something else. Something that translated imperfectly but whose nearest equivalent in English was, she had decided, afraid. Not afraid of human firepower. Not afraid of humans' numbers. The Veth had the numbers, had always had the numbers. Afraid of the gap Castillo had almost named. The space between what you do and why you do it. The space where a woman in a derelict habitat teaches a child to climb the 8 sides of a station and ring in vacuum. Not because it is safe. Not because it is efficient. Not because it serves any tactical purpose whatsoever. Because she wants the child to understand that the fear and the movement can coexist. That you can carry both and keep going. That was not in the tactical documents. The Veth had no frame for it, and Dana suspected, not with certainty, certainty was a luxury she'd given up at 17 on a station she couldn't go back to. That this was the thing they would never fully account for. The cargo drone lifted off. Its navigation lights blinked amber in the base's artificial dusk. Dana watched it go. Medical at 1700. Sleep after that, real sleep. The first in 3 days. Then the Vel Station brief, and whatever came after the brief, and whatever came after that. She got up and took her coffee cup to the recycler and went to find the medical bay. Keep moving. The war was long, so was she. The medical bay at Fob Kessler was 2 rooms and a core staffed by a doctor named Osi, who had the hands of someone who had done precise work in bad conditions for a long time, and the manner of someone who had learned that efficiency was the best kindness. He removed the implant in 14 minutes. Dana watched him work, not looking away, which he had once told her was unusual. Most operatives looked at the ceiling. She had told him she liked to see what was happening. He had said nothing to this, but she thought he'd understood. Clean margins, he said, setting the module in a tray. The amber numerals had gone dark. No tissue adhesion. You were lucky. I was careful, Dana said. With implants at that depth, those are usually the same thing. He applied the sealant gel, covered it with a dressing, 48 hours before full use. Don't lift anything heavier than that coffee cup. You're clearly not going to stop carrying. She looked down at her hand, empty. She hadn't realized she'd brought it. Sleep? O.C. said. Real sleep, not the 2-hour operational rest you count as sleep. That's not a medical instruction. I'm making it one. He began writing something on his pad. The Vel station brief is in 72 hours. 48. Reyes updated the Jewel while you were in debrief. You have time. She looked at her wrist. The skin was clean and sealed. The small rectangular absence of the implant already beginning to close. Without the amber glow of the countdown count, as she always did, briefly disoriented. Not lighter, she was never sure that was the right word, just different, recalibrated. O.C., she said, not knowing quite why she was going to ask this. Do you think we can win? He didn't look up from his pad. Didn't hesitate, yes. Why? Now he looked up. The efficient hand set the pad down. He was 60, maybe 65, and had been practicing medicine since before the Veth came, and there was something in his face that was the product of all of that. The experience stacked up like the salvage field's compressed hulls, immense and layered and somehow still standing. Because you came back, he said. You always come back, all of you. I've had operatives in this bay who should not have come back, physically, and they came back anyway. Patched people up who were out of resources and out of options, and somehow, every single time, they found one more thing to use. One more angle. One more way through. He picked his pad back up. The Veth are formidable. They're organized and they're patient and they have resources we don't. They've never had to want it. They expand because expansion is what they do. You people, he gestured at her, at the door, at the base beyond it. You want it specifically, individually. That's different. Dana thought about this, the wanting, the specific and individual quality of it. The way it was connected to things that had no tactical value whatsoever. A father's voice, a rusted magnet, the smell of recycled air, and how those things were not weakness, were not sentimentality, were the actual substrate of the wanting, the reason it didn't run out. Get some sleep, O.C. said. She went. Her quarters were standard issue and she had made them no more comfortable than standard issue by choice, because she had learned that comfort was a kind of anchor, and she didn't want anchors. But tonight she looked at the bare walls, and the institutional bunk, and the single dim light, and thought that she might, at some point, want a plant or something. Not now. But at some point she lay down. She did not sleep immediately. Sleep was never immediate, not for her, not after operations. She lay in the dark and let her mind run through the salvage field one more time. Not tactically, but architecturally. The stacks. The scale of it. 11 square kilometers of everything the Veth had taken. The Kesari freighter with its oxidized green hull. The polished plate that had reflected the lance back at its source. The core's interior, warm amber, beautiful in its alien completeness. She thought about the Veth commander, rising from the blast on joints that should not have worked, displacement projector, spinning across the floor. The decision she'd made in the 2 seconds available to her, which was not the decision she'd trained for or planned for, but the only decision the actual situation offered. The willingness to make it. You can do both, her father had said. The fear and the movement, she carried both of them always, had carried both since she was 17 on a falling station. And she had learned to think of the fear not as the opposite of the movement but as its companion. The thing that walked beside you and reminded you that what you were doing mattered, that the world was real and fragile and worth the effort. She closed her eyes. Somewhere below her in the base, the cargo drone that had lifted off the refueling pad was already most of the way to its first waypoint, carrying medicine and food and small ordinary things to people who needed ordinary things to be possible. She slept. She dreamed of her father's hands on metal, the patience of them, the way he'd waited for her to figure out the grip. When she woke up, 8 hours later, she lay still for a moment and looked at her wrist. Clean skin, no amber glow, no countdown, just her, just time. She got up. The Vel station brief was not a brief. It was 4 hours of projected star maps and fleet disposition overlays and arguments between ISOC Sr. Tactical staff about approach vectors and strike windows that Dana sat through with her coffee, and her silence and her opinion she offered twice and only when asked. She had learned that the difference between operators and planners was largely a question of timing. Planners needed to argue through every permutation before they could act. Operators needed to act and then figure out what they'd learned. Both, were necessary. She had stopped finding planners frustrating the way she'd found them frustrating at 22, when she'd wanted to be through the corridor and halfway to the target already. The data she'd pulled from Careth 9 was projected on the main display in 3 dimensions. The Veth fleet concentrations, their headings and timelines, the narrow window in which ISOC could hit Vel Station with enough force to neutralize the forward staging area before 3rd Expansion Fleet reached deployment range. The window was 9 days wide. After that, the Veth would have moved, the data would be stale, and the outer settlements, 14 of them between them home to approximately 800,000 people, would be within strike range of a fleet that had never lost an engagement it had initiated. 9 days. Dana looked at the map and thought about 800,000 people doing ordinary things, going to work, putting children to bed, arguing about small things that were large to them, the specific and individual wanting of 800,000 lives continuing. She thought about the commander on Careth 9, rising from the blast with its projector gone, its sensory cluster damaged, and the things she'd seen in that moment, not fear. The Veth didn't seem to process fear the way humans did, but something that might have been, in their taxonomy of experience, surprise. The encounter had not gone the way its calculations predicted. The human had done something outside the parameters of what the tactical models counted for. She had swung a weapon as a club. It was so simple it was almost embarrassing. And yet, after the brief, she cornered Castillo in the corridor outside the operations room. "The Veth analysis of Careth 9, she said. "Has any of it come through the intercept channels?" Castillo considered. "Some. Preliminary reports. They're describing it as a systemic failure of the perimeter assessment. Reviewing the sweep team deployment pattern. Are they reviewing the core protocols?" "Yes, they'll harden the access port. Different interface. Probably biological rather than physical. Slower to access but immune to the extraction module." "What about the reflective deflection of the lance?" Castillo's expression changed slightly. "That compression of the mouth. They've flagged it as an anomaly. An improvisational technique that required prior knowledge of resonance lance physics. They're not anticipating it as a repeatable tactic." Dana thought about this. They're not wrong. It was a one-time solution. But that's not the point. What is the point? They're building a model, me, of what I might do next time. They're building it from the data they have, which is everything I did in a specific context with specific resources. They're very good at that. They built the salvage field from 300 years of collected data. They're exceptional at using what they know. But the thing I'll do next time won't come from what I did this time. It'll come from what the next situation offers. Whatever's there. Ever I can see that they can't see yet. She paused. They can model the past. They can't model the gap. Castillo was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the corridor's narrow viewport, the stars were the stars. Patient and indifferent, and named in 2 languages. "You should write that up," Castillo said. "Not the tactic, the framework. It might be useful for the training assessment revision." Dana thought about sitting down and writing a framework. She thought about her father, who had never in his life written a framework, simply handed her a cargo magnet and waited. Maybe, she said. She probably wouldn't. She went back to her quarters and sat with it anyway. The idea of the gap, the space that couldn't be modeled because it only existed in the present moment between a person and the specific brokenness of the thing in front of them. The Veth were extraordinary. 300 years of expansion, 17 fleet concentrations, the largest collection of harvested civilizations in the known galaxy, catalogued with perfect attention, and yet, she pulled out the small notebook she kept. Paper, because paper didn't run out of power, and wrote 2 words at the top of a clean page. What else? Father's question. The one he'd asked every time he'd picked up a piece of salvage that had stopped working the way it was supposed to. Not, what is this for? Not, what did this do? What else? She looked at the 2 words for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and went to sleep. And in the morning the war was waiting, and she was ready for it. And the coffee was terrible, and she drank it anyway. Below the base, on the fueling pad, another cargo drone was loading up. The lights on the pad were amber in the pre-dawn, and they caught the polished flanks of the drone, and threw the reflection upward into the dark.